racing car is only as good as its parts. And a very important part is the engine. And this engine is not just the most successful in its sport, it is the most successful racing engine of all time. The Cosworth DFV. A little bit of background on Cosworth, though. We did a whole video on them. However, it was founded by a bunch of former Lotus engineers, Mike Costin and Keith Duckworth, and they originally built four-cylinder racing engines for Lotus, but began branching out as reputations grew. And while they were starting to branch out and experiment with contracts like Ford and Chevrolet, Formula One changed its engine rules. They raised the maximum capacity from 1.5 liters to 3 liters, and that was a problem for Lotus. Their engine supplier, Coventry Climax, decided not to invest in building a brand new engine. Luckily, Colin Chapman knew a few guys who knew how to make engines, and he approached Cosworth for a deal. Duckworth said that if he had £100,000 to develop it, or just $1.2 million today, which must be the greatest investment in the history of Formula One, he could build the engine. Colin tried to get funding from Aston Martin and Ford, but to no avail. Initially, you see, a public relations executive at Ford UK, Walter Hayes, got wind of the project and arranged a dinner between Colin Chapman and Ford's NASCAR backer, Harley Kopp. Kopp liked the idea, and an agreement was made. It would be a two-stage operation. First, a 1.5-liter four-cylinder engine called the FVA series for Formula 2. At the same time, this four-cylinder would be used as the test bed for a 3-liter Formula 1 V8. Normally, in order to test an engine, you simply build an engine and start tinkering with it for its compression ratios and its tuning from there. But with Cosworth developing a 50% scale four-cylinder version of it, they could test all of the tuning on a much smaller, cheaper engine and then scale it up and then just put it on a cylinder bank on the side. It was a brilliant system, making development exponentially cheaper and faster. The project was announced at the end of 1965, and for the next 18 months straight, Cosworth tested and built these engines. And I'll tell you, what rolled up on the starting line of the third race of the 1967 F1 season was nothing short of a masterpiece. The DFV, or double four valve, was a 3-liter naturally aspirated V8 with, as you can guess, 4 valves per cylinder, making 400 horsepower at 9,000 RPM. But that is only a part of the beauty of this magnificent engine. Cosworth is notorious for over-designing engines, which made the DFV incredibly reliable, and its 90-degree V-angle made it light and compact. And then, just for good measure, Lotus on their own decided to innovate Formula 1 again by bolting the engine block directly to the chassis, making it essentially a stress member. Granted, it only won 3 races in 1967, but with the kinks sorted out, Lotus dominated the 1968 season, winning 4 races, including a 1-2 in South Africa, taking the title. They took it so convincingly, Ford noticed something. The Ferrari V12 was underpowered. The Maseratis and the Westlakes were unreliable. The BRMs were too complex, Brabhams were outdated, and the Hondas were too heavy. Meanwhile, the DFV was light, small, powerful, efficient, reliable, and cheap. In today's money, it costs £100,000. Think about that. You could either have a Formula 1 racing engine or a marked up Corvette C8. Try developing a modern Formula 1 engine on 100,000 pounds. It's not possible! It was incredible. Basically what Ford saw is no competition. So at the end of 1967, Ford decided to end Lotus's monopoly on the DFV and opened it up for sale for the rest of the field. First, it was picked up by Ken Tyrrell, and then the floodgates were opened. It would be used by Brabham, Hesketh, Lola, Liger, Williams, Marsh, McLaren, Matra, and more. Its simplicity meant it could be added to any design. There were some cars that were literally designed around the engine. They bought the engine and gearbox, and then built the car around it. By the end of its run, it was used by over 90 teams. In 1969 and 1973, every single race of the season was won by a DFV-powered car. And it didn't just stay stagnant. They kept innovating. They kept upgrading it. They evolved it into the DFY as the 1980s rolled around, making 520 horsepower at 11,000 RPM. But time was running out for the 13-year-old engine. And all because of a little car company called Renault. In 1979, the Renault RS01 became the first turbocharged car to win a Grand Prix when it won the French Grand Prix. And as turbocharging became more reliable and commonplace, the naturally aspirated DFV fell off dramatically. Tyrrell driver Michele Alboreto won the DFV's 167th and final Grand Prix victory at the 1983 Detroit GP. Now, considering there have been just under 1,100 Grand Prix held, if you do the math, the DFV has won 16% of all races in Formula 1 history. That is a domination record for an engine never seen before or likely since, not just in Formula 1, because they all design brand new engines every year, but in motorsport as a whole. I mean, barring like the Spec series, which use the same engine, no engine has ever achieved that many wins. And yet it didn't end there. With the creation of the Jim Clark Trophy for naturally aspirated engines in 1986, Cosworth further upgraded the DFY into the DFZ. Granted, it was mainly a transition engine for the smaller teams during rule changes, but it remained in the hands of the ultra-low budget teams until 1993. The last significant action of the DF series in Formula 1 was the Benetton 1988 DFR. It was the most powerful non-turbo engine on the grid with 620 horsepower. It helped Benetton secure 5 podiums and a 3rd overall in the championship. And pretty soon, you might have guessed it, it spread its way to America. This thing is designed for open-wheeled racing after all, and the second most popular open-wheel sport in the world is in the IndyCar series. By 1976, it was here in the form of the DFX, a unique DFV variant, because it was a 2.65-liter turbocharged version for the USAC series that could develop a monstrous 840-plus bhp. Cosworth was initially rather cross with their naturally aspirated engine getting tinkered with turbocharging, but it worked. The DFX was the only engine that could put a stop to the Offenheiser domination of the past, and they won every single kart title but one between 1977 and 1987. The Indy Spec DF engines weren't phased out until 1992. By that time, around the world, the DF series had won 12 drivers' titles, 10 manufacturers' titles, 3 USAC titles, 9 kart titles, 2 outright Le Mans victories with Mirage in 1975 and Rodeo in 1980, and, arguably more impressive than all of that, it powered the Transit Supervan 3. And the crazy thing is, it still races right now. Because Formula One has a historic racing series where drivers will take the historic cars, i.e. the ones with all the DFVs in them, and race them around in their own F1 Historic Championship. So these engines are still in use right now. And they're still winning races now. That's crazy. The thing came out 50, almost 60 years ago. But arguably more important than its longevity or its number of victories was the design philosophy it pioneered, the art of building a smaller engine and then scaling up. Cosworth and many other engine builders use this method to its day. I mean, it's how Cosworth designed the 3-liter V6 for the Nissan GT-R LM Nismo, or Gordon Murray's 3.9-liter V12 for their T50, or Aston Martin's 6.5-liter V12 for the Valkyrie. And fun fact, when they built the small-scale Valkyrie engine, it accidentally became the most powerful naturally aspirated 3-cylinder in history at 250 horsepower. And that V12 is now the most powerful naturally aspirated engine of all time, and a crisp, clean 1,000 horsepower. So the DFV is not only still racing to this day, which cannot be said about many historic engines, its philosophy of designing is an integral part of automotive manufacturing that a lot of people don't take for granted. It truly is one of the most important engines in the history of motor racing.